everybody. Welcome back to the people. You can't see it. It's too shiny. The People of Sparks. This is the follow-up, the sequel to The People of Ember. Nope, just kidding. The City of Ember. What's wrong with me? All right. Where we left off in chapter 1, the people of Ember have made it above ground and have now met the people of Sparks. And the people of Sparks have been gracious enough to invite them into their village. They're just going to kind of assess or figure out what's going on. Torin is a little boy that we met in the first chapter as well. He was the one that spotted them. So I bet he's going to have quite a role to play. One of the things that we know that's happening right now is that they are headed towards the city or the town center. And Torin had made the observation, oh, that's probably where they're going to get something to drink. There's plenty of water to be had there. And then that's going to allow the city leaders, who is that? That's Mary, that is Wilmer, and that is Ben. Those three are the leaders of the city. There's not just one main character, one main mayor rather, as there was in the City of Ember. We've got three that are leading the city. 2 guys, 1 woman. Cool. All right, so let's pick back up with chapter 2. You can find that on page 14. Beg your pardon. Out from below. The people from the dying city of Ember had come up into the new world only a few days before. The first to arrive had been Lena Mayfleet and Dune Harrow, bringing Lena's little sister Poppy with them. From a ledge high up on the great cave that held their city, they'd thrown down a message hoping that someone would find it and lead the others out. Then they'd waited. At first they'd explored the wonders around them, but as the hours passed, they began to worry that their message had not been found and that they would be alone in this world forever. Then, in the late afternoon of the next day, Dune suddenly shouted, "Look! They're coming!" Lena grabbed Poppy by the hand. All 3 of them ran toward the mouth of the cave. Who was it? Who was coming from home? A woman emerged from the darkness first, and then 2 men, and then 3 children, all of them squinting against the bright light. "Hello! Hello!" Lena called, leaping up the hill. She saw who it was when she got closer. The family who ran the Cali Street vegetable market. She didn't know any of them well. She couldn't even remember their names, yet she was so glad to see them that tears sprang to her eyes. She flung her arms around each one and turned, crying, "Here you are! Look, isn't it wonderful? Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Oh, and are more coming?" The new arrivals were too breathless and amazed to answer, but it didn't matter because Lena could see for herself. They came out of the cave, shading their eyes with their hands. They came in bunches, a few of them, and then minutes later, a few more, stumbling out into a light 1,000 times brighter than they'd ever seen. They stared in astonishment. They walked a few steps and then just stood, dropping the sacks and bundles they carried, gazing and blinking. To Lena and Dune, who felt already that they belonged here, the refugees from Ember looked strange in this bright landscape of green grass and blue sky. They were so drab and dingy in their heavy, mud-colored clothes, their coats and sweaters in colors like stone and dust and murky water. It was as if they had brought some of Ember's darkness with them. I want to stop here. Do you see now how that darkness theme that was laid out in Dr. King's quote at the beginning of the book is now tying in? Pay attention to that. Dune suddenly leapt away, shouting, "Father! Father!" He threw himself against his stunned father, who fell backward, sat down on the ground, and burst into a combination of laughing and weeping to see his son again. "There you are here," he gasped. "I wasn't sure. I didn't know." All afternoon they came. Lizzie Biscoe came, and the others from the old high class, along with Clary Lane from the greenhouses, and the doctor who had helped Lena's granny, and Sadge Merrill, who had tried to go out into the unknown regions. Mrs. Murdo came, walking in her brisk, businesslike way, but giving a cry of joy when she saw Lena hurtling towards her. People came whose faces Lena recognized, but whose names she didn't remember, like the shoe repairman from Livery Street, and the little puffy-faced woman who lived on Selverton Square, and the tall, black-haired boy with blue eyes so light that they looked like glints of metal. What was that tall boy's name? She spent a second trying to recall it, but only a second. It didn't matter. These were her people, the people of Ember. All of them were tired, and all of them were thirsty. Lena showed them the little stream, and they splashed water onto their faces and filled their bottles there. "What about the mayor?" Lena asked Mrs. Murdo, but she just shook her head. "He's not with us," she said. Some of the older people looked terrified to be in such a huge place, a place that seemed to go on without borders in all directions. After they stared nervously about them for a while, they sat down in the grass, hunched over, and put their heads to their knees. But the children ran around in ecstasy, touching everything, smelling the air, splashing their feet in the stream. By evening, 417 people had arrived. June kept track. As the light began to fade from the sky, they shared the food they had brought, and then, using their coats as blankets and their bundles as pillows, they lay down on the warm, rough ground and slept. The next morning, they got ready to leave. Lena and June, when they first arrived, had spotted a narrow gray line that ran along the ground like a pencil stroke in the distance. They thought it might be a road. So the people of Ember, having no other clue about where to go, picked up their bundles and set out in that direction, a long, straggling line trailing across the hills. I can almost picture it, can't you? It was on this walk that Mrs. Murdo told Lena and June about leaving Ember. The three of them walked together, Mrs. Murdo with Poppy in her arms. June's father walked behind them, leaning forward now and then to hear what Mrs. Murdo was saying. "I was the one that found your message," Mrs. Murdo said. "Well, it fell right at my feet. It was a clear day after the singing. I was on my way home from the market, feeling sick with worry because you and Poppy had disappeared, and there was your message." She paused and looked up at the sky, trying to keep a few tears from falling, Lena saw. Mrs. Murdo composed herself and went on. "Well, I thought it would be best to tell the mayor first. I wasn't sure that I trusted him, but he was the one who could most easily organize the leaving. I showed him your message, and then I waited to hear the city clock ringing out the signal for a meeting." Mrs. Murdo paused to catch her breath. They were going uphill over rough clumps of dirt, hard walking for city people whose feet were accustomed to pavement. "And was there a meeting?" Lena asked. "No," said Mrs. Murdo, plucking some burrs off of her skirt, and shifted Poppy to her other shoulder. "Mercy, it is terribly hot." She stood still for a moment, breathing hard. "So there was no meeting?" Lena prompted. Mrs. Murdo started walking again. "Nothing happened at all," she said. "The clock didn't chime, the guards didn't come out and start organizing people, nothing. But the lights kept flickering on and off. It seemed to me that there was no time to lose. So I went up to the pipeworks and showed your message to Lister Monk. We followed their directions and we found the rock marked with an E right away, because people were there already." "But how could they be if they didn't have the directions?" June said. "Who was it?" "It was the mayor," said Mrs. Murdo grimly, "and 4 of his guards. Looper was there too, that boy who used to keep company with your friend Lizzie. They had huge bulging sacks with them, piled up on the edge of the river, and they were loading these sacks into the boats. The mayor was shouting at them to work faster. Lister yelled, 'What are you doing?' But we didn't need an answer. We could see what they were doing. They were going first. The mayor was making sure that he could get out, along with his friends and his loot, before anyone else." Mrs. Murdo stopped talking. She trudged along, wiping sweat from her forehead. She frowned up at the bright sky, and Poppy whimpered. "Let me carry the child for a while, Mrs. Murdo," said Dune's father. "Thank you," Mrs. Murdo said. She stopped and passed the squirming Poppy to Dune's father, and they walked on. Lena waited a minute or so, and she couldn't wait any longer. "What happened?" she said. "Oh, it was awful," Mrs. Murdo said. "Everything happened at once. 2 of the guards looked up at us and lost their balance and fell into the water. Well, they grabbed hold of the loaded boats, which made the boats tip and dumped their load into the river. Other guards and Looper knelt down and tried to reach them, but they were pulled in too. In the midst of all this, the mayor jumped onto one of the boats that was still upright, but as soon as he hit it, it turned over and plunged into the river." Mrs. Murdo shuddered. "He screamed, children. It was a horrible sound. He bobbed on the water like a giant cork, and then he just went under. In just a few seconds, he and his guards were swept away. They were gone." They walked in silence for a while, going downhill now. After a few moments, Mrs. Murdo went on. "So Lister and I went back up into the city, and we had the timekeeper ring the bell for a public meeting. We tried to explain what to do, but as soon as people heard the first bit, the way out of Ember had been found, and that it was in the pipeworks, well, everyone began shouting and rushing around. Things turned into a terrible mess. People were in too much of a hurry to even ask questions. Hundreds of them poured through the streets of the city all at once, and outside of the door of the pipeworks, a huge crowd pushed and shoved to get in. So many people, so panicky, and some were trampled and crushed." "Oh," cried Lena, "how horrible." These were people she knew. It was too awful to think about. "Horrible indeed," said Mrs. Murdo. She frowned out across the vast landscape surrounding them, where there were no people in sight at all. "It was impossible to control them," she went on. "They rushed to the stairway. Some people lost their footing and fell all the way down the stairs. Others ran right over them. And then, when they realized that they were going to have to get on those little shells and float on the river, well, some people were so frightened that they turned around and tried to get up the stairs again. And some were so eager to get going that they jumped onto the boats and capsized them and fell into the river and were drowned." She raised her eyes to Lena. "I saw everything that happened," she said. "I'll never forget it." Lena looked behind her at the citizens of Ember toiling across the hills. These were the ones who had made it out. "How many do you think were left behind?" she asked Mrs. Murdo. Mrs. Murdo just shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "Too many." "And have the lights gone out forever now?" "I don't know that either. But if they haven't, they will soon." Hot as she was, Lena shuddered. She and Dune exchanged a look. They were thinking the same thing, she was sure. Their city was lost in darkness now. and anyone left there was lost too. Later that day, the refugees from Ember came to the road that they had seen from afar. It was potholed and weed-cracked, but easier to walk on than the rough ground. It led alongside a creek that flowed swiftly over ground. Nope. Sorry, I'm going to reread that sentence. Please forgive me. It led alongside a creek that flowed swiftly over round, smooth rocks. In all directions, they saw nothing but endless expanses of grass. They shared the food that they had brought with them, but it wasn't much. Soon, some of them grew weak with hunger. They grew faint from the heat, too, which was hard to bear for people used to the constant chill of Ember. Poppy cried when she was set down on her feet, and her face looked flushed and hot. Night came in this strange, gradual way, so different from the sudden lights out that signaled night in Ember. The travelers lay down on the ground and slept. They walked the next day, too, and the day after that. By then, the food they had brought with them was gone. They traveled more and more slowly, stopping often to rest. Poppy was listless. That means kind of restless and not quite with it. Poppy was listless. Her eyes were dull, meaning not bright. And this is also not good news. Finally, around the middle of the following day, they trudged up another hill, and from there they saw a sight that made many of them weep with relief. Farmed fields lay below them in a wide valley, and beyond the fields there was a stream that they had been following, where the stream that they had been following joined the river. There was a cluster of low brown buildings. It was the place where people lived. Like the others, Lena was glad to see it, but it wasn't a bit like the city she had imagined, the one that she had drawn in the pictures back in Ember, the one that she had hoped to find in this new world. The buildings of that city had been tall and majestic and sparkling with light. That city must be somewhere else, she thought as she started down the hill. She'd find it. Not today, but someday. And this concludes chapter 2. What I like about this chapter is how it moves back in time. In chapter 1, we have Torin seeing the villagers showing up into town. But in chapter 2, we go back in time to be able to see the journey of the people of Ember. I found that to be very interesting. That is a very cool writing technique, to be able to shift time. And I'm really happy that the author offered that to us, that now I have the background knowledge of like, how did all of these people show up in Sparks? It's building that background knowledge that helps deepen our comprehension. All right. Guys, will you join me in chapter 3? It's coming up next. Stick around. This story is really, really amazing. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. See you soon.